So what you'll receive from us at the end of this webinar is our handout on what we refer to as the long-term care planning pyramid. Essentially, it's sort of what are the most important considerations when we're talking about long-term care planning, to the individuals themselves. So, control being a big one, balance to the plan, and, protection from having to potentially spend things down. All of those things are very important to people. And sometimes, the control is the most important part of that. So that's the basis of the pyramid. It also has the top 5 reasons to do that planning as well. So some things that people have run into issues with where they, this is a really good reason to start looking into this ahead of time, because if you don't, here's what can happen, right? Then you will also receive at the end of this a feedback form, which is where you can sign up or let us know that you'd like us to set up a time for you to come in and talk to one of us. So our initial consultations are complimentary. We schedule them for about 2 hours. And, if you really want to get in as soon as possible, especially, right away in the new year, you're trying to get sort of, if it's your New Year's resolution, so to speak, to get your estate planning documents done, this can be a really good time to let us know so that we can really get you on the schedule if that's what you're trying to get done as soon as possible. So I would highly encourage, if you, after listening to me talk today, or just in general, you have estate planning concerns, you want to come in and talk to one of us, fill out that feedback form, and that's where you can let us know to reach out to you. And one last thing before I dive into details here. You can send in questions as I'm going through things. So if you have, there's a Q&A function, you can send that in. I'll see those questions come up. So it's meant to be interactive. You absolutely can ask me questions as I'm going through things. So because Medicaid can be a pretty dense topic and information, I'll get started so I don't waste too much more time here. But when we're talking about long-term care planning, one of the biggest concerns that people have of, going into a nursing home, going into assisted living, is the cost associated with it. And that's because it can be very expensive, or it is very expensive. It's not really can be. And that cost ranges a lot for individuals for a variety of factors. One is, of course, what type of care do you need? Do you need a little bit of help or a lot of help? Do you have memory care issues like Alzheimer's or dementia, or is it more physical related health ailments that you need assistance with? I mean, it can be a combination of all of those things that lead to higher or lower cost. But it also really depends on what type of care that person is receiving, like what level of care they're receiving. So there tends to be, sort of 3 main tiers of care when we're talking about long-term care. The first, and generally the most popular in terms of what people are looking to have, not necessarily what they end up having, would be, at-home care. Somebody come into the home a couple hours a week, maybe a couple hours a day to help them out with certain things. That's like a nurse coming into the home or a caretaker coming into the home to help them with cooking, medication, whatever it might be that they need. And this can be the cheapest option for people, but it can also be the most expensive option, depending on how much care that person really needs. When we're talking about at-home care, you're generally looking in like the $30 an hour range, $32 an hour, somewhere in that range. It varies, of course, but that's kind of the average that I've seen a lot. And when you do the math on it, a couple hours a week, that's not too bad. A couple hours a month, not too bad. But when you start to add up to, okay, this is the, round the clock level care, or, the majority of the day, and that's the type of care I would really need in a skilled nursing facility, you go from it being the cheapest option to it easily being the most expensive. It can be more expensive than a skilled nursing facility if you need the type of care that you would get at a skilled nursing facility or assisted living facility, right? If you multiply 30 by 24 hours a day by however many hours in a month, you get very expensive. Not saying that's the type of care they would necessarily need at home care, but it can easily get up there. Then generally speaking, and this would be probably the most common that people start with, when they're talking about long-term care, looking at assisted living facilities. So not a nursing home, but an assisted living facility where they need some assistance. Maybe they have some memory care issues. That I've seen anywhere from like $4,000 a month to $8,000 a month when we're talking about somebody with Alzheimer's or dementia level care, right? Where it's memory care. That tends to be closer to that like $7,000, $8,000 a month range. But I've also seen clients who need some assistance, lower level of care, and they're closer to the $4,500 a month or $5,000 a month. And not that that's not expensive, of course it still is, but it's not $8,000 a month either. So it just depends. The most expensive, barring that situation with at-home care or where it's round the clock, the most expensive is generally in a skilled nursing facility. And that's what most of us think of when we're talking of a nursing home, speaking about a nursing home. And that's the traditional idea of, a nursing home for care. And that can easily get, around $9,000, $10,000 a month or higher, depending on the situation. But, you generally see $9,000 or $10,000 a month for that level of care. And the problem with that cost is not that it's not earned by these places, right? They're providing assistance to people and doing, good work. But the problem is that most of us in retirement are not going to have anywhere near that level of income that's necessary to cover that out of pocket alone without dipping substantially into the savings we've built up. If you don't make $120,000 a year just in retirement, which almost nobody does, some people do, but not a whole lot, you're not going to be able to cover this out of pocket without dipping into savings that you've built up for retirement or for other purposes. So that's where people are concerned about, well, I'm going to have to spend through all of this, or there won't be anything left when I pass away. Or more, I guess, traditionally what people will say is, I don't want the nursing home to take my home, right? And it's a valid concern. If you've spent time, you've been responsible, you've built up all of these assets, and you're worried about it not lasting you long enough to get through care, to get the type of care that you'd want, it's a valid concern. I should mention too, that when we talk about I don't want the nursing home to take the home, we're not referring to the nursing home cannot just go in and say, the home's ours now, you have to hand it over before you go in. What people are referring to when they say that is they're worried about once they're on Medicaid will place a lien on their home potentially at some point, especially if they're single. And that's what they're worried about, is they don't want the value of that home to be eaten up. It's not so much that the nursing home just takes the home, that's not what they do. You're just paying them, and that care can be expensive. And so they're worried about eating the equity up that they've built up. So when we're talking about how do we pay for this, if you don't have enough income to do it, if you run out of money, how do you pay for all of this? There are a variety of options for people. Medicaid is one of the most common, and Medicaid, doesn't step in right away for everybody. You have to financially qualify for it. So in order to qualify for Medicaid, that depends on whether you're married or single here in Wisconsin. If you're single, it's pretty straightforward. They won't force you to sell the home, but that's where they place the lien on it. If you're single, they'll, as they're providing care, they will have a lien that accrues over time up to the point of the equity in the home. Then you can keep one vehicle regardless of the value. You still are able to have a car to transport yourself, get around. You can have life insurance of not more than $1,500 total. So $1,500 face value total. That's obviously most people who have life insurance have more than that, but occasionally you'll see somebody who has the one policy that was from a credit union and was worth $1,000. If you are under that amount in life insurance for face value, then the cash value of that policy does not count as an asset. But if you are over that $1,500 in face value, then any accrued cash value on that policy is an asset of yours that you have to potentially spend through. So, most people with life insurance, that is whole life where it has cash value, probably have, an available asset for Medicaid in that situation. Then they will say you can prepay your burial expenses, up to about $15,000 for yourself, for a spouse, for children. You can pay up to about $15,000 for those expenses, per person. Now, that's obviously there so that you can pay those expenses, and Medicaid isn't, having people be, unable to bury their family, right? They want people to cover these expenses. But other than those things, when you're single, the most that you can keep is about $2,000 in assets. Usually you want to be under that because you don't want to even get close to that. And of the income for that single person, they're only allowed to keep $45 a month of their income. The rest of it has to go to offset Medicaid's cost of, their payment to the care. So obviously that's not a lot of money. $45 a month is not enough to cover most things. And it has not gone up, that number has not gone up with inflation over the last couple decades. And that $2,000 a month doesn't give you a lot of wiggle room when we're talking about, well, how do we pay for this in the event that, how do we pay for things that Medicaid isn't covering? Things that, like let's say you like to go out to eat once a week and you can't do that anymore, or you really like having, for example, the ability to supplement things that Medicaid won't cover in terms of care needs. So I had a client who, they had a wheelchair, a mechanized wheelchair, and that broke down, right? Electric wheelchair. It broke down, they needed to replace it. Well, the problem was the facility had available, ordinary wheelchairs, just traditional wheelchairs that we're talking about. Well, because of that, they couldn't have the quality of life that they were looking for. So when we're talking about this, we really want to make sure that people have what they need to cover expenses. If you're married, the numbers that you're allowed to keep are a lot different, right? So we're talking about that $2,000 is totally different. The income is totally different. The healthy spouse can keep all of their income, the one living at home. The spouse in the facility can still only keep about $45 a month in income. If we have any other assets out there, the healthy spouse is allowed to keep their primary residence. They don't have to have a lien placed on it. If they have any qualified retirement accounts, they're also able to keep the qualified retirement accounts in their name. So if you have an IRA, you have a 401k, those are allowed to be kept by the healthy spouse if it's their retirement account. The retirement account of the other spouse is still available for care. So that can be both good or bad, depending on who needs that care first and who has more of those assets, right? And then all of this stuff is still the same when we're talking about, the life insurance, the car, the prepaid burial expenses, all of that's the same. But in addition to those things that the spouse is allowed to keep, they're going to say, well, that $2,000 now can range anywhere from $50,000 as a floor up to about $148,000 next year as a ceiling of what they're allowed to keep of other assets. So not including the primary residence, not including their qualified retirement accounts. With how they calculate that is they look at all of those available assets, all the bank accounts, things that are available, they divide that in half. And where they fall in that range is where they decide, okay, if you fall within that range, you keep exactly that. If you are below $50,000, you keep exactly $50,000. And if you're over that top of the range, you don't keep any more than $148,000 next year. So Medicaid, though, once it's being started, it pays for the care. So that can be a really good way when somebody runs out of money to continue to pay for care. But obviously it involves a lot of spend down, and that can be a problem for certain people where, I've built up all of this and I'm trying to pass this on, or they want to have some money left over to help supplement things that Medicaid may not cover for them. And that can be a really big concern. There's other planning options available to people. But Medicaid is the primary one that we're talking about. And one of the other tools that's available to people is aid and attendance, or the VA's improved pension program. And this is a VA pension for wartime veterans or the surviving spouses of wartime veterans. And in order to qualify for this, just like Medicaid, there's some limitations on assets, but there's also service limitations too. So the veteran, the actual veteran that the benefits are based on, has to have served for active duty for at least 90 days. So not for training purposes, not in the reserves, like active duty. Doesn't matter whether they were actually in combat or over in the theater of combat. They could have been here in Wisconsin and still qualified for these types of benefits, as long as they were active duty during this period of time. At least one of those days, and only one of those days, actually has to be during the wartime period. So you don't have to have been full 90 days active duty, you have to have been 90 days active duty, but not full 90 days during the wartime period. Just one of those 90 days has to be during the wartime period. And again, like I said, it does not necessarily have to have been the person was over in combat. A lot of times it is, but it doesn't mean that they were. I've had clients that were here during Vietnam, never went over to Vietnam, or were in Korea during Vietnam, somewhere else, right? And still can receive this benefit. One thing to keep in mind with this benefit is the wartime dates are not always what you'd expect. So, it's pretty easy to look up, but if you type in like VA wartime dates, they'll give you the ranges. But to give you an idea, World War II, according to the VA, actually ended on December 31st of 1946, which is not the dates you'd see in a history book or traditionally see in a history book, right? A lot of us think, well, it was August of 1945, it was kind of like when it all ended for the most part, or slightly thereafter. And that's not what the VA says, though. So you might qualify even if you don't think you would. So it's always worth looking into. And like I said, just one of those 90 days has to have been during a wartime period. So you could be really right on the cusp and still qualify. And then the other service qualification is you just can't have been dishonorably discharged. So as long as you were honorable or a not dishonorable discharge, you can still qualify for this. Now, if you are post 1980 as a veteran, that 90 days does go up to 2 years. That's because we don't have any wartime dates set for post 1980. They have to be set by executive action, and they have not been yet. So, just because you are after Vietnam does not necessarily mean you don't qualify as a wartime veteran. You just have a longer period of time that you have to have been active duty. Now, there are financial qualifications for the VA as well. In order to qualify for the VA, they try to use the same numbers as Medicaid. It doesn't matter, though, whether you're married or single. You can have the home and up to 2 acres of land surrounding the home. But you also, if you have more than 2 acres of land, then those count potentially towards the assets that you're allowed to keep at the value of those extra acres. And whether or not you can have more than 2 acres of land excluded depends on your local zoning laws. Does a lot that, a residential lot have to be a certain size, before it can be sold? So that can play a role too. It's just, you can't really predict that because it's so, it's almost at the municipal level where it depends on what you can keep. But other than the home and that 2 acres of land on average, whether you're married or single, they say this year, you can keep about $138,000 in assets before you have too much. Next year, that's actually going to go up to over $150,000 with inflation. So, next year it's going to be quite a bit more than it is currently. Just like Medicaid, that 148, they use similar numbers, but they used a different inflation factor, so it's different. And the end result ends up being slightly off from one another. But for the VA, you can't keep anything else in terms of it not being unavailable. So, IRAs of both spouses count towards that $150,000 next year, and additional real estate, the extra land, things like that. They count towards all of those calculations. So this pension benefit, though, is a direct pension payment to the wartime veteran or the surviving spouse of the wartime veteran. And that's where, I guess, a portion of that population is really unaware that they might even be entitled to receive anything. Now, the amount of this pension that they can receive depends on the income that the veteran also has from other sources. So, to give you just an idea, let's say for a veteran with a married veteran, they could receive about $2,500 a month from the pension amount. That's the max pension they could get. But if they are making more than $2,500 a month, they won't get that benefit at all. And that's because they deduct the veteran's income from the max amount, and you get whatever the difference is. But they're not going to force you to pay back in if you're in the negative, right? So if you're below that amount, you can you get the difference between that. The good news is with this benefit, though, is that they also, from the veteran's income, subtract from calculation any unreimbursed medical expenses. So when we're talking about veterans who are going into a facility where they might need some additional assistance to help bridge the gap between their cost of care and their income, this can be a really helpful tool. So if a veteran goes into a facility, let's say they're making $6,000 a month in income. So normally they would not receive this pension benefit because they have too much in income. But their cost of care is $8,500 a month. Well, when they actually apply for the VA benefit, then assuming they're below the asset limitation, the VA is going to say, well, you have $0 of income because your cost of care is higher than your income. So it can be a really helpful tool in a lot of situations where maybe this person never needs to go on Medicaid, or it stretches their money out a lot further than it would otherwise last. So it can be a really helpful tool. The downside is it's a smaller percentage of the population, so you're not going to have this option available for everybody, not even for all veterans. And that's partially because a lot of veterans right now that I'm seeing, they fall sort of in between the Korea wartime dates and the Vietnam wartime dates. A lot of clients have been, during the Cuban Missile Crisis is a really common time frame I've seen for people, or like the Berlin Wall crisis, and that's, unfortunately, it's not during any of the wartime dates. So it may not be an option for a lot of people or for everybody, but it is an option, and a good one for a specific subset of the population. So if you and your spouse are wartime veterans, it's something to consider. Now, both of those programs, though, do require you to be below certain assets. And so if you're worried about even having to spend down to that point, one really good alternative to look into is, well, let's look at, when we're healthy, when we're a little younger than when you need care, look into getting long-term care insurance. Now, this is not a tool that is going to be right for everybody, but no tool is. But when you want to ideally look at long-term care insurances, I've heard figures ranging on this, but you'll see anywhere from late 50s to early 60s into your mid 60s. And that's mostly when is it going to be the most affordable for you to get. They can also health. So just be very careful when you have if you have pre-existing conditions, if you've already been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, right? Family history shows higher, incidence of Alzheimer's. It's something to make sure that, hey, if you're worried about a higher cost, that could factor into it. But never hurts to look at it. It's always a good idea to get a quote on things. You make the informed decision, right? Doesn't hurt anybody. So this can be a really good tool for people. And this insurance specifically covers the cost of at-home care, assisted living care, skilled nursing home care. Doesn't necessarily cover all of it, but it will generally cover some portion of the daily amount. You'll get a daily benefit from it that says, it covers $300 a day, for example. And you'll these days see a maximum on the amount of payout, so the total amount it'll pay out, and a maximum on the amount of years that it'll pay out. So I see a lot of 3 years maximum benefit, or up to $500,000 paid out, right? So it varies, and that's going to be very different depending on how much somebody's paying for it, what they qualify for, what the companies offer, right? So it just looking into it, though, that can significantly help somebody not have to spend as much down through their assets, and also potentially meet private pay requirements of a facility. If you have one of the old long-term care insurance policies, because some of these are out there, where you don't have any maximum amount, pays out like $500 a day. That's an exaggeration, but pays out $500 a day, let's say, and there's no maximum, it pays out forever. If you can afford to keep that policy, don't get rid of it, because you're never going to find anything like that again. So, that can be a really good tool for people. So the reason it's important, if you can, to pay for 1, 2, 3 years of care out of pocket or from a source other than Medicaid, for example, it's really important because a lot of these facilities now are starting to say, okay, we'll let you live here on Medicaid at some point, but first we're going to ask that you pay us, for 1, 2, or 3 years of care out of pocket or from other sources other than Medicaid, before we'll let you live here on Medicaid. And that's because Medicaid, when Medicaid pays the facility, they always negotiate for a lower rate than the actual private pay rate is. So these facilities, they're asking for a private payment because it helps them stay open, right? They're going to get more money from a private pay than they will from Medicaid in the end. So for their own ability to continue operating, this is necessary for a lot of them. And if you're able to meet these private pay requirements, though, if you can meet that 3-year private pay requirement, and that's the higher end of that I've seen, well, then you have a lot more choice in where you end up. So if you need to be on Medicaid right away, and a lot of people do, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's true of a lot of people. Well, not every facility is going to be available to you right away. Not every facility has all the Medicaid beds they need, or some facilities don't accept Medicaid at all, right? And they only accept private pay. Well, if you can't privately pay for very long or at all, your options of which facilities you have available to you are just going to be more limited. So the more you can privately pay, and this I suppose is true of most things in life, the more you can privately pay, the better those benefits are going to be. The more options you have available to you in terms of amenities, locations of facilities, things like that. So the long-term care insurance can be a really good way to do this. You can also privately fund that. If you just have enough assets to do that, that's one thing. Or if your income's high enough, you can do it, right? So that's where the VA can be very helpful too, to bridge that gap longer, privately pay longer, right? Or if somebody is willing to spend down through their assets to that point, that's also something they can look at. Now, when we're talking about, well, what happens when you get to the point of, I don't want to spend down past a certain point. I want to make sure I have money available to myself. So, or available to my family, so that if Medicaid doesn't cover something, I have this ability to supplement things, right? Well, in order to do that, a lot of people talk about, well, should I put the home in the kid's name, right? Put the assets in the kid's name, gift it over to them. And what that does is that's a divestment for Medicaid, meaning if you're familiar with the 5-year rule, which a lot of people are, if you apply for Medicaid benefits and they are going to look back at the previous 5 years of financial records, and you have to tell them about these things. You can't say, I just forgot to tell you, right? That if you lie about it, it's fraud. So you have to tell them about these transactions. And if you've gifted anything away, you've done anything that's a less than fair market value transaction, Medicaid will say, we're going to give you a penalty based off of that. And that's not a financial penalty so much as it is, they tell you the certain period of time, they're just not going to help you. They won't pay for your care for a certain period of months based off of the amount that you gave away. So when that happens, when people gift all of this money away, the issue can be, well, what happens if they're not able to get all that money back to pay through that period of time, right? What if it's all spent at that point? So that can put people in a really hard spot of, I can't pay for my care because by definition, to be on Medicaid, you have to financially qualify. But my family also can't pay for my care because they've spent the money. And that happens a lot, especially when people are unintentionally creating these divestments. But when people are intentionally doing it, you still want to be aware of the 5 years. But when you put things directly in the kid's name, there's risks associated with that. So, first and foremost, I hope you trust all your kids. But if you have concerns about control or about, losing access to things, the number one way to lose control over something is to have somebody else own it. So like with the home as an example, this is where you'll hear stories of people who get kicked out of their own homes, right? You hope that doesn't happen, but it can, because now that person owns it and they do have the legal right to say, you either pay me rent or you get out of here, right? So you hope that doesn't happen, but it could. There's legal ways that can happen. The second is that if you transfer something, if you gift things like real estate or stocks over to your kids, you don't have them purchase it from you for fair market value. They essentially get whatever your cost basis is in that property. That's what their cost basis becomes. And that's how capital gains are calculated. What's the difference between the sale price and those cost bases and those assets? The problem with that a lot of times is when people do that with the home, maybe they built their home, they paid 30 grand for their home in the 70s, right? And now it's worth 250 grand. Well, when they transfer that to the kids, the IRS is going to say that's worth 30 grand to them as well. And when they sell it, if they sell it after that person's passed away, let's say, they're going to have $220 or $20,000 in capital gains that they're going to have to pay tax on. If they had inherited that property instead, they would not have to pay any capital gains tax right away, because they get a step up in basis up to fair market value at the date of death of their parents that they inherited it from. So it's much better to inherit property like that for tax purposes than it is to have it gifted to you, because you can wipe out most or all of the capital gains that way. But the biggest concern with gifting assets over to the kids directly in their name, rather than using other alternative planning strategies, is that whatever happens to the owner of a property happens to that property. So what I mean by that is, if I own my parents' home that they're living in and I get sued, well, I have an asset now that I didn't have before that I don't have a lot of protection over because it's not my primary residence, but I own it and it's available for those things potentially. or if that person gets divorced or files for bankruptcy, right? That's available for that as well. And these are not things that people are intending to open their assets up to of other people's liabilities. But when you leave it to them directly, you gift it to them directly, this can be a problem. So it's much better to use other strategies to protect against those things. And you can do better planning through other tools, primarily through things like irrevocable trusts are very commonly used for this, because those are not available for the kids' liabilities. They don't own the property yet. It can get a step up in basis, so they don't have to worry about capital gains tax when they inherit that property and sell it. And there could be terms put in place like you can't be evicted as long as you're paying the expenses. So you get more protection that way as well. I'm running out of time here and I don't want to go over too much. So just a quick reminder that you'll receive a couple things from us. Like I said, our long-term care planning pyramid, the feedback form, which is going to be really helpful to you if you need us to set up aside time to talk. And especially with the beginning of the year, it can be a good idea to get that in so that we get everybody on the calendar if that's what you're looking for. And again, those are complimentary initial consultations. Our next webinar is going to actually be on January 4th. And very timely with that, of course, it's the top 5 reasons you should get your estate planning done in 2023. So think of that as our New Year's resolution course of if you haven't gotten your will done and you're really trying to get that done, that's a good time to start thinking about it, right? I promise you it's more pleasant than making a gym-based resolution where it's like, I got to go and get in shape. I like to think I'm much more pleasant to talk to than going to the gym, but I suppose that's a matter of interpretation. So with that, I will wish everybody happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year and all that. And hope to see you guys in the new year of 2023. If you would like to set aside time to talk to us, please let us know through that feedback form. With that, like I said, hope you have a good rest of your day.